So I tried to do an internet search to better understand the reasons why we love to be frightened. And I wasn't really able to come up with much of anything. There were all kinds of opinions about it, but let me explain why I was doing that. You and I, or at least I will say I, may not appreciate over-the-top kind of terror movies, but we have to admit that they are incredibly popular. There is the Saw movie franchise, SAW, Saw movie franchise. It started back in 2004, and it's led now to the production of a dozen movies, with Saw 12 coming to a theater near you this September. And the movies are terrifying. True crime podcasts have a big audience. Stories that make us feel fearful, they say, will give us an adrenaline boost, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And murder and suspense stories have always captured our imagination, no matter what kind of format we find them in. Child psychologists will tell you that fairy tales are an important part of a child's development, that by exploring them, children can begin to make sense of some of the tougher parts of life and begin to figure out how they can face them. Now, all of that may help explain why something that is called North Sea TikTok has become so popular. Now, the North Sea is sometimes called the most dangerous body of water in the world, and I'm not entirely sure if that is true. It's part of the Atlantic Ocean. It's bordered by the UK, Norway, the Netherlands, and Denmark. I had to look it up. Geography was never my thing when I was in school, but that's where it is. And I will tell you that videos on North Sea TikTok are both fascinating and terrifying. There are clips of those boxcar-sized containers just tumbling off ships into the sea like a pile of Legos. There are videos of frightened crews wearing life vests trying to keep their footing with water rushing over the bow and into the bridge. And then they're made even more ominous by the soundtrack that almost always accompanies these videos. It's a clip from a Pirates of the Caribbean movie. Well, let me just show you a really quick example of what these videos look like. Bring the sound up. So that will go on and on and on with all these clips of all these terrifying things happening. And while I may not like Saw movies, I have wasted a lot of time watching North Sea TikTok videos. Now, we have no walking on water on these storms, but you can imagine that pounding waves and howling winds would create the atmosphere for some good old-fashioned fear. That popular series, The Chosen, about the life of Jesus, does a very good job of making the part of Peter and Jesus' story that Ella shared with us a minute ago very frightening, with high winds and lightning and pounding rain. But I'll have to admit that, movies aside, when I read the story of these disciples finding themselves caught and struggling in a mighty headwind and drifting away from the shore, it doesn't really come across as being all that frightening in the moment. At least not until the disciples think they see a ghost making their way toward them. They're not at all bothered by the storm, really, until that moment, kind of, working against it. But then they see this apparition coming toward them, and that being is not at all bothered by the storm, and that's when their fear really begins to ratchet up. Now, it's not a ghost. We know that it is Jesus, and it's the disciple Peter who is the first to recognize him. But before we get to what happens next, I think it's helpful if we just take a really quick look back. Matthew tells us that this whole scene takes place right after the feeding of the 5,000. And the disciples have just witnessed a miracle. There wasn't enough food to feed a hungry crowd. And then there was just a little bit of food. And then everyone ate their fill, and then there was some leftover food, which makes me wonder if they were also having that same conversation after a community meal. What do we do with the leftovers? Do we save them? Do we send them home? What do we do? But that's another story for another time. What ties these stories together is that after the meal with 5,000 guests, Jesus does what Jesus is going to do more than a few times. And he just sends the disciples away so that he can take some time on his own to pray. So the story that we're sharing today is one in which the disciples are without Jesus close by. They're left to their own devices. And that doesn't seem so terribly difficult. After all, these are men who had been making their way in the world long before they met Jesus, long before Jesus gathered them and called them to follow him. So they ought to be able to handle things on their own for a bit. And also, from the feeding of the 5,000 along the shoreline to this incident in the boat, we realize now that so very many of Jesus and Peter's encounters are going to happen on the water or near the water. Last week we talked about the day that Peter met Jesus while he was fishing, and Jesus surprised him with a huge catch of fish, one that threatened to sink the boat, another miracle of sorts. And then we have another story of Jesus traveling with the disciples in a boat with a huge North Sea style storm arises, and Jesus is sleeping and everyone is frightened. There's no walking on the water in this story, but Jesus commands the waves to be calm and asks the disciples, "Why were you terrified?" But this time we can imagine that the storm is troublesome, but probably not something that they haven't sailed through before. Sudden storms are common on this lake. They still are, the Sea of Galilee. So it's not the waves that are so frightening, but it is that image that they see of someone walking toward them across their water, and their very first thought is that has to be a ghost. And this is one of the times when you do wonder if Jesus just wanted to do a head slap and ask, seriously? After all you've seen me do, ghost is your first thought? And so he calls out to the disciples. He does what Jesus does. He speaks so that they can be reassured. And he says to them, be encouraged. It's me. Don't be afraid. Standard Jesus sort of stuff. Just calm down. I got this. But then our hero for this season, Peter, says, Lord, if it is you, then call me out to the water with you. And let's pay attention to the fact that no one has suggested to Peter that he should try such a fool thing. No one has asked him to get out of the boat, just to see what happens. Not his fellow disciples and not Jesus. It is Peter who takes it upon himself to ask for that little bit of proof. Lord, if it is you, let me come to you on the water. And Jesus says, all right then, come. And so Peter steps out of the boat and he takes a few amazing steps. Might have even allowed himself to kind of soak in what was happening to him and with him. But then the story says he loses his focus, and he notices those waves, and he notices the wind, and he realizes that he is not in a good situation at all, and he begins to sink. And he cries out to Jesus to rescue him, and Jesus does so. But then Jesus has a few words for Peter. He says, you man of weak faith, why did you begin to have doubts? And then they both climb into the boat, and the wind dies down. The storm is over, and the sea is calm. And I wonder how Peter is feeling at this very moment. The scripture doesn't really mention him again in this part of the story. It only says that the other disciples began to worship Jesus and say, truly, you are the Son of God. But you have to wonder about Peter. Wet, probably cold, maybe more than a little bit embarrassed. And we have this tendency when we read this story to consider it a classic example of a failure of faith. And we wonder, why couldn't Peter just stay focused on what, with Jesus' help, he was doing? We take in this story and we think to ourselves, I think what it teaches me, if I lose my faith, if I take my eyes off Jesus, then I'm going to sink like a rock, just like Peter. But friends, more is happening here. Jesus did not come up with the idea that Peter should get out of the boat and try to join him on the waves of a stormy sea. But Jesus didn't stop him from doing it either. He didn't ask Peter, well, have you prayed about it? Have you read up on it? Have you talked with a coach about technique and strategy? He didn't ask him, are you certain you really want to try this? If you've weighed all the pros and cons. He didn't say, maybe you should start small with some bathtub walking perhaps before you jump out of the boat in the middle of a treacherous body of water. All Jesus did was say, okay. And more than that, he invited Peter then to join him on the water. And so yes, when Peter looked down at his feet and realized what was happening, and then he looked up at the waves, he got scared and he lost his focus and he began to sink and he cried out to Jesus, rescue me. And I'll admit, when I read this story, I always hear Jesus speaking fairly harshly to Peter, you man of weak faith, why did you doubt? But you know what? I can also hear Jesus speaking to Peter more softly, tenderly, gently asking him, why did you lose your faith? Why do you still have doubts? And then offering him a towel to dry himself up and a little space to collect himself. Because isn't that how we encounter Jesus? I mean, when we mess up, we can imagine that we have disappointed Jesus, disappointed others, but usually it's our own voice that is the hardest to hear. That's the one that wakes us up at 2 a.m. and tells us we were foolish for even trying something new. That's the voice that says, roll that tape one more time so that our minds can view the replay over and over and over again, dissecting every wrong decision, every wrong step, and wishing that we could just rewrite the script so it comes out differently this time. Early in my ministry, I helped place orders for youth events and church youth groups for probably hundreds of those WWJD bracelets. Those silicone bracelets with the question, WWJD, what would Jesus do? I'm sure I still have a few lurking somewhere in my dresser drawers. The purpose of that campaign was, and it still is, a good thing. It's about being kind. We may need, indeed, the question more today than we even needed it back in the 80s and the 90s. But we know what Jesus would do, right? Jesus would save the outcast, serve the hurting, turn the other cheek. And we know, don't we, that that's what we should also be doing. A writer and theologian, a pastor by the name of Nadia Bolz-Weber reminds us, she says, faith isn't you doing the impossible. Faith isn't you doing the impossible. It's remembering that God can and has and will do again the impossible. And then she goes on to say, to have faith is to know that God is, and we don't have to be. And then to have faith is to know that's a good thing, because history has shown us that we make terrible gods, and there are not really any tests of faith. We can't prove our faith by wearing a bracelet any more than we can prove our faith by walking on water. We can't prove our faith by serving others and living humbly, even those are the things that Jesus would ask us to do. Our faith is simply one decision after another, and that decision is to trust Jesus, to know what he would have us do, and to trust in his mercy and his grace, and yes, to try our best to live as Jesus lived. And then to know when we need him, he will rescue us. The song that we're going to share so often during this season, the one that we use to open our worship today, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, it includes these words, Jesus sought me when a stranger wandering from the fold of God. He, to rescue me from danger, interposed his precious blood. Jesus sought out Peter and invited him to come and see, even if that meant coming and seeing what it was like to demand a test for Jesus to prove himself once again. And then when that demand led to trouble, Jesus sought Peter out again, rescuing him from danger. And so we can ask then, what does it mean for us to be saved? What does it mean to be rescued by Jesus? We have the promise of the cross, more so the promise of the empty tomb. And Jesus rescues us from having to spend our days worrying about the mysteries of death. We often think of Jesus rescuing us from sin, offering us that so very good gift of grace and mercy, and all of that are part of our walk with Jesus. But from what else do we need to be saved? What if we feel as if we're moving through this world only on our own power with no one to help us and no one to care? We long for a home and a homecoming. What if we've been made the victim of somebody else's choices and we're desperately seeking a way out and the courage to make it so? What if we've been taught you should never trust a stranger and always suspect those who are different, and to believe that those people are worth less than those people? Theologian Barbara Brown Taylor shares this idea. For some, the need is liberation. For others, the need is homecoming. And for still others, the need is acceptance. No matter our experience or our deepest needs, Jesus saves. Jesus saves. And so from what do you need rescue? And from what do you need to be saved? Knowing that the Latin root of the word salvation is salvus, and it means to be made whole. A wholeness that comes from a peace that passes understanding. Spiritually safe and secure in knowing that God is with us and that Jesus has shown us what to do and how to be and whom to serve and how to love others, and yes, how to love ourselves. And so Jesus saves by offering us a salvation of peace within and a desire for peace all around. So can we be witness to this drama on the high seas and take it in with neither fear nor judgment? Can we hear Jesus saying to Peter, to the disciples, and to us that faith means living out of your heart? And yes, you are going to take some bold steps, and sometimes everything will go as you hoped, and other times you'll find yourself drowning in self-doubt and the criticism of others. But in his saving, Jesus says, you have what you need, what I have given, and what I will continue to give. My salvation, my wholeness, my sacrifice, so that you can live faithfully, even if you feel like you're drowning. You know who I am. Trust me and trust yourself, and stop trying to prove who I am, and stop trying to prove yourself. I have rescued you. I invite you to come, and I will rescue you again and again and again. I am Jesus, and I am the one who saves. Would you pray with me, please? Holy One, sometimes you do call us into deep water, and other times you meet us there when we've jumped out in our own and are in need of rescue. And so hear us now as a congregation. We join our voices together and we lift up these words of affirmation. May these words remind us of who you are and how you invite us into a life of discipleship and trust. I believe in a God who moves toward me when storms rage. I believe in a God who invites me to be brave. I believe in a God whom the wind and the waves obey. I believe in a God who knows my name. I believe in a God of love, and I am not afraid.